ACT-1. The Believer. You're 34 years old when they hand you the orders. It's December 1979. Outside your window in Leningrad, the Neva River is frozen solid. You've been a decorated officer of the 40th Army for 11 years. You've read Marx. You've read Lenin. You believe in the project. Not the way frightened men believe in things. Not because someone told you to. Not because refusing has consequences. You believe the way a surgeon believes in the body. You understand how it works. You understand what it's built for. You come from a family of soldiers. Your grandfather fought at Stalingrad and came back with one ear and a story he never finished. Your father spent 8 years in East Germany, eating bad food and teaching young men how to hold a rifle like it was an argument, not a toy. You graduated top of your class at the Frunze Military Academy in 1968. You speak passable Dari. Studied it for 6 months in preparation, just you and a cassette player and a stack of Nada cards on the kitchen table. Your wife Galina thought you were insane. You thought it showed initiative. The official language around the mission is careful. International duty. Fraternal assistance. Stabilization. Nobody says invasion. You don't say it either. You tell Galina it'll be 6 months. You tell your daughter Natasha, who is 7 years old, that Afghanistan is a country near India, and that you'll bring her something beautiful. She asks if there are elephants. You say you'll look. You land at Bargrol. The cold you left behind in Leningrad was the cold of civilization. Wet, gray, familiar. This cold is different. This is a cold that has no interest in you. Thin air at 1,500 meters above sea level. Mountains that look drawn in pencil against a white sky. Mountains that have been watching armies come and go for 3,000 years and feel nothing about it. Within 48 hours, you understand something your briefings did not prepare you for. This country doesn't look like the maps. The maps show roads. The roads don't behave like roads. They become suggestions. They become traps. A paved highway outside Kabul turns to gravel, then to dirt, then to nothing. And the nothing goes on for 40 kilometers. Your unit is the 5th Guards Motor Rifle Division. You have 2,400 men under your operational command, T-72 tanks, BMP infantry carriers, artillery. On paper, you are an overwhelming force. But Afghanistan doesn't fight you on paper. The first week, you lose a supply truck to a mine on the Saling Pass Road. 2 men dead, 3 injured. The mine was probably there before your army arrived. Maybe it was left by someone who had nothing to do with anything. You file a report, you adjust the route. You don't adjust the way you look at the mountains, not yet. For the first 4 months, you almost believe the optimistic version. You establish your headquarters in a requisition government building south of Kabul. You conduct joint patrols with the Afghan Army, the DRA, the Democratic Republic of Afghanistan. You attend coordination meetings with Soviet advisors who arrived years before you. They have the hollow eyes of men who already know the answer but have stopped saying it out loud. You run 40 to 50 operations in those first months. Convoy escorts, checkpoint security, village clearances. You capture weapons caches. You find smuggling routes. You report progress to Moscow, and Moscow reports progress to the Politburo, and the Politburo reports progress to the Soviet people, and the Soviet people read it in Pravda over breakfast and feel reassured. The distance between your reality and that newspaper is roughly 3,400 kilometers. The Mujahideen don't fight like an army. That's the first thing that destroys your framework. You were trained to fight armies, formations, supply lines, command structures, flanks. You can find a flank. You can exploit a flank. But the Mujahideen have no flanks. They have villages and valleys and cousins in every valley. They attack and dissolve. They don't hold ground because ground isn't what they're fighting for. They're fighting for something you can't capture and can't destroy. You write this in your personal journal on March 4th, 1980. You write it carefully, in a small handwriting, on a page near the back, not the front. You are already understanding things you're not sure are safe to understand. Someone whose name you never know, someone filtered through 3 layers of handlers, says fighters are using a compound on the eastern edge of the village. You order an artillery strike. 64 shells. 40-minute window. Clean military language for a terrible mathematics. When your ground unit enters to assess, they find the compound destroyed. They also find 12 civilians, a family, 3 generations, 7 of them are children. Your report uses a phrase that exists in all armies and all languages. Collateral casualties consistent with operational parameters. You write it, you sign it, you file it. You don't sleep for 3 days. Not dramatically, not with nightmares. You just lie awake, completely still, staring at the ceiling of your command quarters, listening to the wind come off the Hindu Kush. On the 4th day, you eat breakfast, conduct your briefings, and review the intelligence for the next operation. And the rationalizing starts the way it always does. Quietly, logically, reasonably. They were warned. The village was warned. The fighters used them as cover. That's on the fighters, not on you. You followed protocol. Protocol exists for a reason. The mission is larger than any single outcome. You almost convince yourself. Almost is where you'll live for the next 7 years. ACT 5. The machine? By 1981, you have found your rhythm. This is the part nobody tells you about, how competent you become at something you're not sure should exist. You know the Panjshir Valley like a second home. You know the insurgent supply routes coming in from Pakistan. You know which tribal leaders can be negotiated with and which ones can't. You know which DRA officers are loyal and which ones are selling your patrol schedules to Ahmad Shah Massoud before the ink is dry. Massoud. You respect him in the way that a chess player respects an opponent who keeps finding moves you didn't see. He controls the Panjshir Valley. You've conducted 5 major operations against him. You've pushed him back, burned supply depots, cut routes. He retreats, reorganizes, and the valley belongs to him again within 3 months. Every time. Your men call this the accordion war. It stretches. It compresses. Nothing holds. By this point, your unit has suffered 84 casualties, 31 dead, 53 wounded. You know every name. Not because the army requires you to know every name, because you read every file and you make yourself remember. Lieutenant Volkov, 22 years old, Voronezh. Sergeant Petrov, 29, 2 kids. Private Bashirov, 19, had been in country for 16 days. You keep the list in your journal. The journal is full. You've started a second one. There's one day you will carry for the rest of your life. You're passing through during a patrol assessment, not combat, just movement, checking terrain. An old man outside a mud brick house sees your convoy slow. He doesn't run, he doesn't hide. He walks to the road and holds out a clay cup of tea. Your driver looks at you. You get out of the vehicle. You sit with this man, Rahmatullah, he says. Rahmatullah. For 22 minutes, your Dari is functional, not fluent. His Russian is non-existent. You sit in the shade of his wall and you drink the tea, bitter, cardamom, too hot. And he talks and you understand maybe a third of it. He is 70 years old. He survived the British. He survived the king. He survived the Republic. He will survive you too, his eyes say, not with hostility, but with the calm of a man who has outlasted everything. He refills your cup without asking. When you stand to leave, he says something you understand completely. He says, "Every army thinks it is the last army." You nod. You get back in the vehicle. You don't put it in any report. But you think about it every single day for the next 40 years. The league gets bigger. The Mujahideen have Stinger missiles now. American-made. Shoulder-launched. Heat-seeking. A kid on a hillside with 6 weeks of training can take down a Mi-24 attack helicopter worth 4 million rubles. In the first 3 months after Stingers appear, you lose 9 aircraft. 9. The skies over Afghanistan, which were yours, are no longer yours. Your men start calling the Mi-8 helicopter the Flying Coffin. You request updated tactics from Moscow. Moscow sends a committee. The committee produces a report. The report recommends adaptive operational flexibility. You read it twice. It says nothing. You are now 5 years into a 6-month mission. Your daughter Natasha is 12 years old. You've been home twice. The second time, she was polite with you, the way children are polite with distant relatives. You sat at your own dinner table feeling like a guest who had stayed too long at someone else's party and couldn't find the door. Galena doesn't ask about Afghanistan anymore. She used to ask. She stopped asking in 1982. You don't know if that means she's accepted it or given up on it. You're not sure those are different things. What you now and cannot say, Frinhagen, sitting in your command center at 11 p.m. with 2 colonels and a bottle of vodka. Known. The war cannot be won. Not it will be difficult. Not it requires more resources. Cannot. The verb is definitive. You cannot hold what you cannot understand. You cannot pacify a population that doesn't distinguish between your army and every army that came before it. You cannot win a war where the other side measures victory simply by still being there 20 years from now. They have time. You have orders. Those are not equivalent currencies. You read a careful memo to your divisional superiors. It is 17 pages long. It uses measured language. It cites operational data, casualty ratios, supply consumption, territory held versus territory controlled. It distinguishes between those two things. Most military reports don't. You wait 6 weeks for a response. The response is 4 sentences. It acknowledges receipt. It thanks you for your analysis. It reminds you of the strategic importance of the mission. It extends your command assignment by 18 months. You fold the response into quarters and put it in your jacket pocket. You wear it there for a week without knowing why. Maybe to remind yourself that you sent it, that you tried, that you knew. 9. The cost comes due. Last officer dies on the Salang Pass. Major Dmitry Orlov, 31 years old. From Novosibirsk, where the winters are so cold the trees split. He had been with you for 4 years. He could read terrain like text. He spoke better Dari than you. He had a theory, which he shared with you over tea every week, that the war could only end through politics, not military action, and that the politics would take a generation, and that the best any soldier could do was minimize harm while the generation passed. He was right. He died when an RPG hit the lead vehicle of his convoy. Instantaneous. The report says he would not have suffered. You arrange for a Soviet flag to be sent to his mother in Novosibirsk. You write her a letter. You spend 4 hours on it. The letter tells her he was brave, which is true. It tells her his work mattered, which you are no longer sure of. It does not tell her that you think the whole enterprise that killed her son was a catastrophic miscalculation by men who will never set foot in this country. Men who made their calculations at a conference table in Moscow while wearing warm suits. You cannot write that, so you write brave. Brave and proud, and his country thanks him. You seal the envelope. You don't read it again. When Mikhail Gorbachev becomes General Secretary in 1985, something shifts in the air. In 1985, something shifts in the air, invisible but real, the way pressure changes before a storm. By 1986, he's calling Afghanistan a bleeding wound. That phrase reaches you in a radio transmission. You play it back twice. A General Secretary of the Soviet Union, the man at the top of the machine that sent you here, is describing this war with your words. With the word you've been writing in your journal for 6 years. You feel 2 things simultaneously and they don't resolve. Relief that someone powerful has finally said the true thing. And something colder. The understanding that it took this long for the truth to travel from a valley in Kunar province to a podium in Moscow. That distance, that gap between what soldiers know and what governments acknowledge, is where Orlov died. Is where 84 of your men died. Is where those 7 children in Shiwaki died. The gap between what is true and what is officially true. That gap has a body count. You know exactly what it is. You've been keeping the list. General Gromov walks the bridge alone. That's for the cameras. In reality, the withdrawal took 9 months, and it was meticulous, painful, and suffused with a silence that had no name. You crossed the bridge 3 days before Gromov. Your convoy, what's left of it, your men, the ones still standing, you don't feel triumph. You feel something closer to the end of a sentence that started a long time ago and never meant what you thought it meant. You've been in Afghanistan for 7 years, 2 months, and 11 days. You leave behind 15,000 Soviet soldiers, dead, 35,000 wounded, A country torn open in ways that won't close for decades. A generation of Afghans who have known nothing but war and will know nothing else for another 30 years. Your personal list, the names in your journal, has 147 entries. You stop counting the ones on the other side. Not from indifference, from the understanding that counting them would require you to confront a number you don't have the strength to carry. Leningrad, March 1989. Natasha is 17. She has her mother's eyes and your jaw, and the look of someone who made peace with your absence so completely that your presence is now the disruption. You stand in the kitchen of your apartment. The refrigerator hums. A radio plays softly in the next room. You are in your uniform. You will never wear it again after today. Galina puts a plate of food in front of you. You eat it in silence. She sits across from you and doesn't say anything, and you don't say anything, and the silence is not hostile. It's just enormous. A silence that has been growing for 9 years. You don't know how to cross it. You're not sure she wants you to. You pour yourself vodka. You pour yourself another. Natasha comes out of her room, looks at you the way you'd look at a stranger in your house who seems harmless but whose presence requires explanation. She says, "Are you okay?" You say, "Yes." It is the most convenient thing you've ever said. The country you served, the country you crossed the bridge for, ceases to exist. You sit in your apartment in what is now just Russia, and you read about it in the paper, and you try to find the feeling that fits. There isn't one. It's not grief exactly. Grief requires love. It's not relief exactly. Relief requires resolution. It's closer to the feeling of having spent 7 years defending a wall and then watching the wall fall down and realizing the wall was never about the wall. The wall was about something people believed the wall meant, and the belief was a story, and the story was a lie, and the lie needed soldiers, so they sent you. You find work as a security consultant for a trading company. You drink with other Afghan veterans sometimes. Afghansi they call you, the Afghans. Men who came back hollow and were handed nothing. No parades, no national gratitude. The Soviet Union wasn't in the habit of admitting things that required parades. You have a recurring thing that happens. You won't call it what the doctors call it, because naming it feels like defeat. Where you are standing in a grocery store and the fluorescent lights do something to the air, and for a moment you are on the Saling Pass and every person in the aisle is a potential ambush, and your hands know what to do before your mind does. It passes in seconds. You put bread in the basket, you move to the next aisle. You never went back to therapy after the 3rd session. The therapist was young. He asked the wrong questions. He wanted to know how you felt. You wanted to explain the mathematics, the gap, the distance between what soldiers know and what governments acknowledge. He kept bringing it back to feelings. You stopped going. Final section, the reconing. Here is what you know, at the end of it. Not what you were told. Not what you were told. Not what you were trained to believe. What the years rode directly into you, the way cold writes into stone. You know that every great power that has entered Afghanistan has left it smaller than it arrived. The British, the Soviets, the Americans. Each one arrives with the same certainty, each one departs with the same silence. You know that a soldier is the most honest instrument of a state's intentions and the last person the state will ever tell the truth to. You know that that gap between what is true and what is officially true, does not belong only to the Soviet Union. It belongs to every flag that has ever been planted and ground it did not understand. You know that the old man in Ghazni was right. Every army thinks it is the last army. None of them are. You know that those 7 children in Shiwaki are in every report you ever filed, every commendation you ever received, every glass of vodka you've drunk since 1980. You know that Orlov was right. The war could only end through politics, and the politics would take a generation. The generation passed. Afghanistan is still Afghanistan. And you are 74 years old, sitting in a small apartment in St. Petersburg, and your daughter visits on Sundays now. You repaired something eventually, slowly, over 20 years, and sometimes she brings your grandchildren, a boy who is 7 and a girl who is 4. The girl asked you once what Afghanistan was. You said, a place very far away. She asked if there were elephants. You smiled. For the first time in a long time, genuinely smiled. I never found out, you said. I forgot to look.